Welcome. You're just on time. We're just getting started. Great. So I'm delighted to be here and have the opportunity to share my parents' story during World War II. When World War II was raging thousands of miles away, a young, first-generation American Jewish couple embarked on a remarkable correspondence. Their story is told through several thousand letters written daily over 3 years, some 8 to 10 pages long, many handwritten, and many photographed on V-mail, a process the armed services used to expedite getting mail overseas. So first I read my dad's letters, thinking they would be most interesting, and I started with when he was overseas. And after a while, I started to wonder, well, what was my mom doing at the same time? What was happening in Brooklyn, New York? Initially, I thought that my parents' letters would make a wonderful story for the family. And as I kept reading, I realized that the letters by my parents, who were well-educated, politically active, and socially conscious, were of interest to a much wider audience and revealed a remarkable story. My book is unique. From all the research that I did, there is no other book like this. My dad, being trained as a historian, saved and sent home my mom's letters, often saving them in his gas mask until he had a packet that he could send home. He only destroyed a few of them when he was in danger of being captured by the Germans and he didn't want his Jewish identity to be known. It's hard for us to think about communicating only by letter and waiting weeks for mail in our world of instant communication. It was a tremendous challenge for me to decide what to include and how to go about doing that. What emerged was a conversation as I excerpted pieces, with questions and responses often separated by weeks. I've learned that each of us has a connection to World War II, whether it's through a parent or a grandparent. It's hard for us today to imagine how everyone was involved with the war effort. All the men went. My 3 uncles, my uncle's brother, every family was impacted, and everyone waited for mail. The mailman rang the doorbell on the street in Brooklyn where my mom lived if there was a letter from overseas. And everyone supported the war, bought war bonds, lived with rationing, sent multiple care packages. There's one funny family story that my dad really loved Hellmann's mayonnaise, and Hellmann's mayonnaise was not available in Mississippi where he was in training. And so twice, caring relatives wrapped up a glass jar of mayonnaise, one in a sock and one in a sweater, and in both cases, the packages arrived with the mayonnaise in smithereens, and my dad didn't get to enjoy it. But the thought was there, and they all tried to send what the soldiers really missed. My dad, like most soldiers, talked very little about his experiences. He showed his medals to me and to my brother. He was very proud of his Silver Star, his Bronze Star, and his Purple Heart. My mom never talked about those years. They were painful memory for her. But imagine opening up a carton full of letters hidden away for 70 years. And it's through their letters that their story emerged and became the heart of my book. Part 1. In May 1943, my dad sets off for Camp Shelby, Mississippi.
May 20th, Fulton, Kentucky. Beloved, we're south of the Mason-Dixon line now and still don't know where to. But now it's southward. Got my first sight of cotton bales. Well, darling, I have now loved you in 10 states in 48 hours, and in some for the first time. Well, it's Mississippi for sure, and most likely Shelby. Lenny.
During the first year, my dad was training for the infantry in the swamps of Mississippi. He became a scout, often going ahead with the officers to meet with the underground because he had ability with foreign languages. He knew Yiddish, he learned German, he knew French, he learned Belgian and Walloon. Meanwhile, my mom was working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard as a machinist, building periscopes for the Navy and a union organizer. She was a true Rosie the Riveter. Basic training was very difficult, and my dad writes,
June 5th, my dearest, to really understand my letters, you should sit in the sun, turn on all the gas jets on full flame till the temperature is about 105 degrees, sweat and perspire thoroughly. There, that's just right. Last night, when I fell in with my company and the regiment marched out at twilight, we walked in silence because we were practicing a forced march approaching enemy lines. Think, if you can, of long column of young men in green uniforms, green helmets, brown faces, and brown rifles blending into the green forest we were entering. We've got to go 6 miles in an hour and a quarter. The guys suffered from heat and sweat and from dust and thirst, from fatigue and nausea, from every kind of ache and pain. But they felt, now we are becoming soldiers. This is the real test, not those right faces and left faces. They felt they must come through now, even if they had failed before. Lenny.
My mom had a tough time in the factory. The older men did not welcome women working alongside of them, and they didn't make it easy. July 10th, dearest Lenny. Today I had a pretty miserable day at work. It seems that every Friday something happens. You know, I've told you of all the practical jokes that the men play. Well, this afternoon took the prize. When I returned from lunch and started to work, in about 10 minutes there was a terrific odor all around my machine. I couldn't discover where it was, but I knew it was Limburger cheese. It made me quite sick, and I had to go upstairs and lie down. When I came down again, I learned that it had been spread on my electric light above the machine. When the light became hot, the cheese just smelled vile. They did it to me and another girl. She became so sick, she had to go home. It may sound funny, but it wasn't, Diana. My dad endured the heat of the Mississippi swamps in July and digging trenches in the frozen ground in December, training either to go to the Pacific or to Europe. August 24th. Lenny, darling, when you write about the jungle tactics that you are learning and how you are learning to get along in the jungle, I get a little concerned because these are things I know nothing about. Perhaps I should start getting used to climbing trees and hills and crossing creeks because, as you know, I'm not very good at those things, and you might want to continue them when victory is ours and you come home. My Tarzan husband may require a jungle mate, Diana. The training was unbelievably strenuous and physically challenging.
September 18th. Sweetheart, we were off into the woods. Night had fallen long ago, and a steady rain made the obscurity palpable. Then the forest became jungle, tangled vines, and thicket tearing at our uniforms. The blackness was so dense before us that we moved along now, holding one hand on the shoulder ahead of us. Suddenly, the ground began to slope downward more and more. And suddenly, the 4 men before me disappeared even from arm reach, and we heard the splash of water. And not a second later, I was flying, kerplunk, into the morass. It seems we reached a cliff, and the slippery mud gravity had greatly accelerated our progress. Lenny.
Back at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, not only the union organizers, but those who were joining the union were intimidated. September 30th. Dearest love, the company has definitely discovered that people are joining the union, and I think they also know who started it. Their main strategy has been to try and frighten a few of us, and also to scare the others away from us. They've not come out in a full frontal attack yet. But last Tuesday, my assistant foreman called me over and said in a very angry voice, "I hear you're going to join the union." Since I didn't want to commit myself one way or the other, I just said, "I'm thinking about it." Then he went into a 15 to 20-minute attack against unions. When he finished, I wanted him to know he hadn't frightened me, and so I said, "I'm still thinking about it," and I walked away. Your Diana. A major decision for my parents was whether or not to have a child, knowing that my dad might not return. June 10th. Dearest, I saw a very cute cartoon. A woman with a baby in her arms says to another woman, pointing to the baby, "We call him Furlough." Well, when I come to see you, I will bring my equipment, so we won't have a furlough unless we decide to. Your Diana. They made the decision, and they were lucky. I was conceived on my dad's first furlough home. And in the slide picture, the picture of the two of them together on the bottom, that's the picture from that weekend. January 19th. The baby also sends his best wishes to his daddy. I don't know why, but I always think of the baby as a he. It's not really certain yet, although I think the sex is determined already. Diana. My parents were socially conscious and early on concerned about the plight of African Americans. It was my dad's first experience in the South with segregation.
February 22nd, dearest. Jackson, being a capital city, is metropolitan in air. It's small, a mere 40,000. Its antebellum monuments and buildings are few. It was burned in the Civil War and nicknamed Chimneyville, as only chimneys survived the fire. Of course, under the Army's restrictive policy, it was impossible for me to visit the Negro community, but it was noticeable that Negroes appeared to move more easily than in Hattiesburg. 40% of Jackson is Negro. Their homes closer, schools nearer, Negro school children walking on white streets. Never so in Hattiesburg, Lenny. October 3rd. My dearest, let me tell you about one of the more interesting days I've spent in Mississippi. I got a pass to Hattiesburg and decided to take a bus. Of course, there was the perennial unpleasantness of the colored section in the rear. Since Negroes are a majority of the population, but only 6 or 8 seats are reserved for them, they must often wait hour after hour for a seat, while white sections may be half empty. Lenny.
Dad's year of training is coming to an end.
April 28th. Dear Diana, all day gone with endless clothes checking and headaches. This place is a tremendous mill through which vast numbers are being squeezed under great pressure toward the invasion front. By the way, censorship begins at this point, so consider that in your letters now, Lenny.
Part 2. On D-Day, my dad sailed to England, a replacement in the 30th Infantry Division. He fought in some of the most dangerous battles in Europe. Luck played a part throughout. My mom became a mother, while mail became increasingly delayed. June 20th. Dearest, today is just 2 weeks I've not had mail from you. It's been funny, writing to you every day, not knowing where you are, whether you are on the ocean, still in the United States, whether you've landed anywhere, or whether or not you're already doing things. I've sort of had to hold on to my emotions and keep them in a separate place in my heart. You understand what I mean, Diana and question mark. Dad is in Normandy now and wonders if the baby is born.
August 2nd, female. Dear Diana, some days I miss you so much, and I get ever so much more eager for Junior to arrive. Blasted Nazis, 6 weeks, no mail, Lenny.
My Aunt Lucy shares the news of my birth. August 6th, dear Lenny. Hurrah, hurrah, you have a big baby daughter weighing 8 pounds, 13 ounces. You can be proud of Diana and question mark. Diana took it like a trooper. Mama and Daddy saw her soon after and said she's fine. Saw the baby too when she was 15 minutes old. They're already prejudiced. They called her beautiful. I hope this gets to you soon. I also hope that you're home to celebrate your daughter's first birthday. Do a good and fast job on the front now. There's so much more for you to fight for now, Lucy. Dad's descriptions become more graphic as they race through Europe after the breakout from Normandy.
September 24th. Dear Diana, we've seen them often enough in the movies. The tragic pictures of burning farmhouses, of panicky horses and cattle in stampede, of families pitifully trying to rescue a few belongings, or the steady trickle of refugees down the dirt roads on foot, by bicycle, drawing babies in children's play wagons in terror of the artillery shells bursting all around. This is the third country where I have seen that happening. It makes it very vivid to me that I am protecting you and Betty Lou. I've seen men going at the risk of their lives through the fighting lines to bring back a bottle of milk or a bag of potatoes, and the heartbreaking look when startled by a Nazi shell explosion, he drops the bottle and sees it break on the ground. Lenny.
Meanwhile, the fighting intensifies as they approach the borders of Germany and the Siegfried Line. Dad describes the face of war.
September 26th. Dearest, there are scenes one never forgets and crimes one never forgives. The soldier who goes into action expects to take it because he is prepared to dish it out. In total war, civilians in war plants can't be exempt, but there are still some criteria of humanity somewhere. When the Germans compel a town to evacuate, driving the people down a road in confusion, and then turn loose an artillery barrage on the road, well, that's the Nazis. As interpreter, I was called in by the medics to speak with the wounded, where they could still talk, about where they were injured, to help keep families together. There was one woman with 3 kids, 2 injured, whom we got together but couldn't locate her husband. In another case, we found the wife and 2 kids, along with the injured father. Of course, there were some very critical cases, and some beyond all help. Our boys have seen much, but this shocked them into speechlessness. In complete silence, they broke out what reserve K rations we've picked up to feed those kids. Remember Mariner in the North Star and her reply to the old farmer? She says, the face of war is not for the young, and she says, we are no longer young. There were 4-year-olds there yesterday who will never be young. Lenny.
My mom shares her feelings as a new mom. October 2nd, dearest. I realize, my darling, that you can hardly advise me on the care of a baby under the present circumstances, but I know that you want to know about my problems, and also it helps me to just write about it. In any case, I'm much calmer now than when I wrote you the first letters about her. You see, I was very scared when I brought her home. I thought she would break any minute, and that I must do everything perfectly, or something horrible would happen. Well, by now I'm a little more accustomed to handling her, and I know she won't break or fall apart even if I make a mistake. Diana. A few days later, my dad writes graphically.
October 6th, V-mail. Dearest, well, sweetheart, the deciding phase of the war is on, and your husband is not in a ringside seat. He's in the ring, and the punches are flying fast and furious. Things are now in such an interesting stage that all that happens must wait till after time's to be told. in new, strange, and still hateful places. Still my love goes homeward to you and all I hold dear. It is regrettable now, above all, that my letters must wait, but I pray the ones sent in the past week keep reaching you gradually. Lenny.
My dad was among the first Americans to reach Fort Ebenemel in Belgium immediately after the Germans retreated. He sent home 4 huge Nazi flags to be used by his union to raise money for the war effort. They covered the flags with dollar bills at union rallies. October 17th, dear Lenny, 2 of the Nazi flags that you sent came today. I guess the other 2 will come shortly. Boy, they are tremendous. I didn't think they would be anywhere near the size when you wrote about them. I got a very peculiar feeling when I opened them up. I felt like tearing them to shreds. But then I thought it over and I realized they're just symbols and not the enemy, Diana. And there's a family story. When the box arrived with the 2 flags, my mom is opening it up, and they were musty, and they were smelly, and they were dirty, and they had been flying over this fort in Belgium. And my grandmother, living in a small apartment building in Brooklyn, New York, as some of you may remember, and so some of you may not know, but in those days, women hung clothes out to dry and to air from the window by a pulley system that went from one building to the next. So my grandmother starts to reel the pulley, and my mother lets out a scream and says, "Mama, Mama, you can't hang a Nazi flag out the window in Brooklyn." And of course, they never hung it up, and the flag remained somewhat smelly and musty. With time, my parents' stress and strain increased. Here my mom shares her true feelings. December 20th, dear Lenny, darling, you didn't give me any unnecessary worry in the 4 long letters. You know, I have a pretty fair idea of what an infantry soldier does, and so I've said many times I want to know as much about it as I can. If I sounded a little scared, well, darling, I am, and I think I have cause to be, even though I agree with all the reasons that you have listed for me not to worry. You know what I mean, don't you? I'm proud and happy in what you're doing, but I'm also worried and waiting so impatiently for a better future. Those are the contradictions, darling. I guess you face them also. I think you're doing a fine job. Just keep it up, and I'll be okay. Diana. On January 21st, 1945, my dad was severely injured in the Battle of the Bulge.
January 22nd, dearest, no letters because 120 and 121 was a lot of war. 121, I was wounded in action, honorably but seriously. I want to get this to you before the telegram. It took a 105-millimeter gun on a German self-propelled tank at 10 yards to get your husband. It was because I obeyed orders against my better judgment that my luck ran out, Lenny. P.S. Break the news gently to my folks. January 25th. Dearest, I'm really comfortably in a big modern hospital near Paris. It may take some time, but I will be okay. Thanks to plasma, 6 pints, penicillin, about a few dozen needles, and sulfur, I seem in pretty good shape and much less pain than I would expect, not more than when I had my tonsils out. I had one very bad moment psychologically when they carried me in here and laid me on a real bed with sheets in a warm room. The realization brought back for one moment all the concentrated horrors of the past 5 weeks, and it was hard to bear for a while. Sorry I won't be at the finish line, but I did a good job running intelligence for the guys carrying the ball. And don't worry, I'll be home and okay too. Please tell the folks not to be too worried, and take care of yourself and Betty Lou. Let our friends know, as I shall not be writing much. Lenny.
February 8th. Dearest, I think for the first time that you are in the Army, I find it difficult to write you a letter. This is the third time I've started. I destroyed the other two. It's not that I don't know what to say, it's that I don't know how to say it to you in words that are in my heart. Dearest, how are you? I'm trying very hard to be worthy of you during this very difficult and painful period you are going through. You see, Lenny, when I received the letter that you were hurt, it took all my assuredness out from under me, and I broke down and I cried as I haven't for a long time. I guess all the accumulated months of tension were now released. Now, of course, since I've had more mail from you and I know more of the details, I'm back on my feet and I'm trying to do you proud. Diana. Their luck continued. My dad was one of the first soldiers for whom an experimental skin grafting technique was successful. He went on to fully recover, but it took well more than a year, and he didn't come home until I was 18 months old. It is through their letters that we hear the story of the triumphs and sacrifices of ordinary people in an extraordinary time. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions, and in some ways that's the best part of this whole thing, is to hear what people are curious about that I didn't touch on. So, yes. Yeah, so I'm Elizabeth Fox, and my middle name is Louise, so my parents named me Betty Lou, and that stuck probably till I was about 5. I mean, we were living in New York City, I think of Betty Lou as a very southern name. So by about 5, I was Betty, and then at the age of 13, I went to summer camp, and as many kids do, and I came home and I said, I'm Liz, and I never answered to Betty again. Yep.
Did your
Yeah.
parents share this with you when you were younger? I mean, the letters, or how did you find out?
Okay. So interestingly, as I said, most soldiers talk very little about their war experiences. I think that's their technique of that's how they handle it, by putting it compartmentalized. My dad, as I said, was very proud of his medals, and he showed them to my brother and me on numerous occasions. I knew there were letters. My mom did not want to look at them. She always said they were from a very painful time, and it was in the past. My dad, on the other hand, being a historian, when he came back, he sat with the letters and went through and took out where all the censorship blackened lines were. He would write in what was missing. And so the letters that said somewhere in Germany, somewhere in Belgium, somewhere in France, he wrote where he was. And so as a result, while I was working on the project, Sid was able, with maps that he had actually brought back from Europe, to trace his route, and we could figure out where exactly he had been. And then we followed some of the route as I was doing part of the research. So I always knew they existed, from the time I was close to being an adult. I don't think I knew as a child. And they were in my mom's house in the closet, and I was not supposed to look at them as far as I knew. And then when she passed away, we're cleaning out the apartment, as you do, and my brother said to me, how about if I take the medals and you take the letters? And it was okay. It really was okay with me. And so the letters came to my house in Colorado, and they sat there for a number of years. And at a certain point, I just decided I needed to open the box. And when I did, I found a jumble of packets. So they were not totally a mess, but they were packets with either a rubber band that had disintegrated or a ribbon that was still intact. But they were not in any kind of chronological order or anything. So that was a huge job. And my son, who's much more detail-oriented than I am, came home one summer and said, Mom, if you have a bunch of shoeboxes and index cards, I will put them in order. And once he did that, then I could tackle it. So that was amazing that he did that for me. And that was kind of how I got started. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you try and question your father about his experiences, and he just clammed up, or even talking about the medals in terms of why did you get this medal?
Yeah, he would say that he got the medals for bravery. He would say for doing things that he needed to do. I I was either 9 or 10. I know I asked him if he ever killed anyone. And he really didn't want to answer that question, and he really evaded it and kind of changed the subject. Much later, very close to before he passed away, he was quite sick at that point, and my brother came to visit him, and he opened up to my brother in a way that he had never really opened up before, and shared some of those experiences, some of those really hard experiences with my brother. And even to this day, my brother's reluctant to go through the details, although I have a sense of some of the things that he said. He was in direct combat, so clearly he was fighting for his life. Yeah. Yeah.
Did any of the early letters when he was in basic training address any kind of NSA?
Yeah, and that's a very frequent question that I get. So one of the things that's unusual about my book is that my dad was in basic training for a year, and I have the letters that were written daily from training, and there are very few books out that cover anything about training. So he was in Mississippi. He was at Camp Shelby, which was a huge camp. There were a number of other Jewish boys from Brooklyn. There were a number of Jewish men from other communities. The vast majority were not Jewish. And the best way that I can answer that is that, it was well known that he was Jewish. He went to services, he celebrated the holidays, and so he continued to be a private. And at the same time, he had responsibility for activities that normally would not be given to a private. He was teaching first aid classes, he was teaching map reading, he was teaching all kinds of skilled activities, which normally would not happen if you were just a private, and he never really advanced throughout. He applied to officers candidate school, he didn't get accepted, and he was college educated. He has a master's degree from Columbia, so the only thing that I can say is that I believe there was some anti-Semitism, and I do make some reference to that in the book. Whether it was overt, I don't know. Not directly. He does indirectly, and that's where I inferred that he felt like he kept getting passed over. Although some of his immediate officers were very supportive of him. So it's a mixed, I'm not quite sure, it's a mixed story. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about your mom's experience?
Yeah.
In terms of life as a civilian? That's something you don't hear that much about.
Yeah, and again, that's why I think my book is unique, because there's really nothing that talks about the home front in the detail. So my grandparents lived in East New York in Brooklyn, which was a pretty lower class, middle class working neighborhood. They worked in the garment industry. Once my dad enlisted and my uncle enlisted, my uncle went into the Navy, my aunt and my mom moved back in with their parents because on the soldier and sailor salary, they couldn't maintain their own apartment. Some women moved in with other women, but very few women were able to maintain their own apartment. And so the four of them were living in this two-bedroom walk-up apartment, and then I came along and I was living there too. My mom worked in the factory. She had gone to night school, to mechanic school. She was working an 8-hour shift, standing on her feet. There's lots of descriptions of the foreman really not setting up work on time and making it difficult, and her frustration because she's working for the war effort and really wants not to waste a moment, and he keeps saying, I'll get to setting up your job. Meanwhile, he's setting up all the men's jobs. And eventually she learns how to set up her own job, and that's better for her. Once she became pregnant, however, she no longer was it considered appropriate at that point for a woman to stand in a machine shop for 8 hours a day. So she leaves that, and then there's a whole sequence of letters where she's looking for work that's suitable for a pregnant woman and doesn't find anything that really makes sense for her. So then she ends up home for the part of the pregnancy. There's a lot of talk about, what rationing was like, what the shortages were. There's talk about blackouts, curtains being drawn, and there's lots of description of family gatherings. She continued to go to her in-laws for Shabbat dinner every Friday night. And then she would take the letters and read parts, and then the family would get frustrated because they would want to hear the other parts, and she'd say, those parts are for me, those parts are not for you. So she did that. There's talk about celebrating the holidays. And then the whole anticipation of my birth, the whole arrangements for how she would get to the hospital when there was no gasoline, there were no taxis. And interestingly enough, the family physician, who I guess he had an allotment of gas because he was a physician, he came to the house and took my mom to the hospital, which would never happen today. So there's lots of talk about, and then after I was born, lots of stories about child rearing and child care, and the differences are striking. Those kinds of things are cyclical, raising children, and so some of the practices really seem very bizarre right now, and others seem fine. So yeah, there's a lot about the home front. Yeah, Charlotte.
So tell us more about the union organizing. Was she involved with the union before she went to work at
Okay.
New York?
No.
And how did this all come to be?
Yeah, so my dad was the union organizer, and he came from a family of union organizers. My grandfather was a union organizer, and my grandfather even had gone from New York to Cleveland, which was like a big deal in the early 1920s, to attend some kind of huge union rally. And so my grandparents were involved with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. My dad, after college, it was Depression years, he finally got a job with the New York City Welfare Department, and he got involved and became a union organizer for the welfare department. And actually, the reason he enlisted fairly late for his service was because he was encouraged not to enlist because the union needed him. And then in 1943, he felt like he had to go, and he enlisted. So my mom, before she became the machinist, she was trained as a dietitian, and she was working in hospitals in New York. And I'm not really sure whether she was involved in union activity then. But once she got to the shop, she became very active in organizing. And there's lots of descriptions about the rally they tried to have, and this intimidation, and how many people were really afraid to show up. They were afraid they'd lose their job. So. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about your background? Unless you did, we apologize for walking in late.
That's fine.
Are you also an historian and a writer?
Okay, sure.
Other books?
Sure. So this is my first book. My background, I did study history in college. I was always interested in history. Then I became a vocational rehabilitation counselor, so I worked with very severely handicapped individuals. And then I was a mom for a while. I stayed home for a while. Then I went back, became a teacher. But the common theme throughout my entire adult life is that I've been very active with Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, and I have been a national board member for many years. And a lot of the skills that I have that make it possible for me to have written the book and do what I do comes through what I learned through leadership training through Hadassah. So that's basically the story. Yeah. Yeah.
So you said you went to Europe to do research.
Yeah.
So were you like tracing his route? Like what kind
Yeah.
of things were you doing over there?
Okay, so early on, my dad had taken us to France, and we had gone to the beaches in Normandy, where he landed in Utah Beach, and then we had gone to a place called Saint-Lô, which was leveled during the war, totally rebuilt when I was there, because I was there in the early 60s, totally rebuilt. But he had been in battle there. And so France we had pretty much covered. And then when we were doing the research for the book, we decided that we would go to Belgium. I wanted to go to the fort where the Nazi flag came from, because one of the flags is still in my family. And I wanted to go there. And also, there's lots and lots of description of fighting in a place called Normandy in Belgium. And there was a huge Christmas battle there and Christmas bombing, and I wanted to see that town. And I also was hoping to connect with people that he had reconnected with. So during the war, lots of local people would take the soldiers in, and they would feed them, they would house them. When they weren't actually in battle, they would be hosted by the local people who were so grateful to hear the Americans had come to save them. And so in 1978, my dad had gone back with my mom and reconnected with his family in Normandy and visited them. The older folks were gone, but the daughters had grown up, who were children when my dad was there. And so I had their names and I had the town. So we went back hoping to find them. And unfortunately, the second sister, there were two girls, had just passed away. So we never connected with her. But we did trace his route. And when my parents went in 1978, the fort was still not open to the public. Were not able to visit it. But I Googled the fort and found out that they make special arrangements to visit. So I wrote to them and I explained my dad was one of the first Americans to arrive at the fort and I really wanted to visit. And I got back an email and it said, sure, but for us to open the fort for you, there's a $300 fee. And I thought, this is really important to me, but $300 to open the fort. So I wrote back and I said, is there any other way that I can do this? And the gentleman wrote back and he said, well, actually, we have a group of soldiers coming from Wiesbaden, Germany, American soldiers, in the period that I was going to be there. I had given him dates that I could possibly be there. And he said, if it's okay with you, I will check with them, and if it's okay with them, you can join the group for no charge. Okay, so that's how it worked out. And we joined the group, and it was really interesting because they were families who were vacationing from Germany in Belgium and had come to visit the fort. And one of the things that the guide asked was that I explain why I was there. And so it was really interesting, and it was very meaningful for me and meaningful for them. And I'll just say one other aside. We say fort, and in my own kind of naive way of looking at history, I'm picturing a fort. We all picture a fort. And it turns out a fort in Belgium from World War I originally and then World War II is dug out into a mountainside. So all you see is the metal door, and it's almost camouflaged. So they had a ring of forts. Fort Eben Mill was only one of about 6 forts in strategic locations. And if you just drove by, you wouldn't even know there was a fort there. And yet when you went inside, it was 3 stories high, cavernous rooms, bedrooms, loads and loads of places for soldiers to sleep, kitchens, intelligence rooms, all kinds of rooms. And yet from the outside, it looked like a hill. So, yeah. Yeah.
I want to ask, first of all, it was so lovely having you read the Truman voices. You really think the presentation
Yeah.
was really very pleasant and really
Thank you.
very intimate. I just wondered, did your parents continue, do you think, to have a kind of an insular relationship? Because they seemed, if you can communicate for all that time just by writing letters, that's a pretty amazing relationship. Do you find that as they continued that kind of, they seem very tight together? And
Okay, so it's clearly a very intense love story, and that continued throughout their lives. I think that it's a little bit hard for us to think about the kind of commitment that they and others, and by no means were they alone, there were thousands of people who felt so strongly that they had to fight to defeat Hitler and sacrifice and give up everything, basically, for a better world. And it's just a concept today that's just kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around. It's just a different world today. So yes, they were always very close. They were always involved in intellectual discussions. They did a lot of reading, and then they would discuss. One summer they read Freud, and they would have these big discussions about it. So they continued to, I would say, to be very compatible. Yeah.
Jewishly, was your father very observant or
Yeah.
cutthroat or anything that caused issues for him in his service?
Yeah, so he came from a very Orthodox family. My grandmother in particular, his mom was very Orthodox. Dad, not so much, but she went along with it. And he, early on, he actually did some training, and there was a point where he thought he might become a rabbi. So he was very knowledgeable Jewishly, historically and biblically. He knew all of that stuff inside out. But as he grew up and matured and studied history, he moved more away from the religious part of it into the more academic or cultural. My home was very full of Yiddishkeit. It was not a religious home, but when he married my mom, she didn't come from a religious family. And so there was, we always celebrated holidays. There's a lot of Yiddishkeit, a lot of Jewish tradition, but not the actual religion. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you get to visit Camp Shelby?
Not yet. Not yet.
I can tell you, it hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed?
I got stuck there for a few months once.
Okay, really?
I don't know what it is for now. It's a refugee, they house refugees. Really? And when there's mass movements, I think they probably have a bunch of separated kids down there.
Do you think, really? Because it's interesting you say that, because when I did my research, which now is going on a couple of years, that was not the case. It was closed, so I need to look into that.
They mothballed it. It's like a...
Right.
It's a National Guard, Mississippi National Guard base.
Right.
But they open it up when they have a need for it, because there's still, when I was there, which
Yeah.
was probably 12 years ago, there was still the World War II barracks around, and then we had massive movements of Haitians and Cubans, and I think they probably have...
I am really glad you shared that, because I had no idea. I'm going to look into that.
Don't go in the summer, because it is 100.
Yeah, well, he describes that, and very cold in the winter. So, yeah,
Question?
yeah.
Can you describe what happened after your dad came back? What the reintegration was like?
Sure. So he was actually in the hospital in Massachusetts for about a year. And when he returned, he was pretty much recovered. And it took a while for him to kind of figure out what he was going to do. He went back to the welfare department for a while, and then, because they held his job as a veteran. And at a certain point, after a couple of years, I think he just needed to figure out what he was going to do with his life. And so he ended up going to work for a private vocational school that gave adult ed courses to advance in things like New York City civil service and other things of that sort. And he found he had a real knack for writing curriculum. He was very successful at it. And yet he was working for somebody else, and so he had the idea to open his own adult vocational school and have the kind of courses that he wanted to have. And so through friends, he was able to link up with a financial partner. So my dad provided the brains, and the other gentleman provided the funds, and together they ran a very successful school for about 25 years in Manhattan. Yeah. And there's one more part to the story, which I will share. As I said from the beginning, he was a historian, and so he always had an interest in the 17th century, British 17th century, John Milton, that particular area. And it came from a contest. He was in graduate school, and as I said, it was Depression time. There was no money. He was going to graduate school with holes in the bottom of his shoes. Talks about not having good shoes. And so there was a contest, and I don't remember if the prize was $10 or $5, but if you wrote an essay, there was a prize. So he wrote this essay on John Milton, and it really sparked his interest. He won the contest, and it started a lifelong passion for studying the poet John Milton. And so he eventually became an independent scholar of John Milton and wrote 3 books and over 30 articles, and was quite well known in the field, although he was never affiliated on the faculty of a university. So that's what he did. Yes?
Did your father have more buddies that he kept up with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in 1964 or 3. Anyway, in one of those summers, we did a cross-country trip. We started out in New York, and we were heading to California, and we were to visit 3 of his Army buddies that he had kept up with. And it's this picture that's a little vague on the bottom, the guys all together. That's his squad, and that's the tight-knit unit that those guys really depended upon each other for their lives. So we're going to visit 3 of those guys. One had actually passed away. He died only about a year after the war. And so we get to Indiana, and the first family we're going to visit, they're farmers. And they're in rural Indiana. And here come, my dad and mom from Brooklyn, city folks, Jewish, and here are these rural Christian farmers. And the welcome was unbelievable because they were squad mates. And then we continued on, and I also fondly remember visiting somebody outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And again, it was so completely different from my experience growing up in New York City. So yes, he did keep up. And my understanding is that several of them came to New York at various times, but I was grown by them when they came. But interestingly, I had the idea that wouldn't it be great if I could find the children of some of these guys who would be like me, or maybe a few years younger if they were born after the war. And so a friend of Sid's, who's a genealogist, had said, you know, if you give me their names and the cities they're from and any information, I'll see what I can do. So we gave him the barest of information, and up to this point, I've really only located one family, but it's been wonderful because I located the son and daughter of a man named Charlie, the guy from Indiana who I had visited. We had met. The children, his children were a few years younger than me, but they also remembered meeting me and meeting my brother, who was born after the war. And they were so excited when I contacted them and told them I had written the book. Again, their dad also had talked practically not at all about the war. And he is in this photo. They had never seen the photo. There are 2 photos in the book that they had never seen, and I was able to make a copy because I have the photo and send them the actual, copy of the photo, and we've been in touch. So that to me has been very exciting, and I still hope maybe I'll find one of the others, but it hasn't happened yet. So.
Did you try the War Department to try and get some records of these?
I didn't, and part of the reason is my dad was in the 30th Infantry, and there was a big fire, and all the 30th Infantry records burned. So there's very little available, but
reconstructed, the members who ran the 30th Infantry Division
website.
actually have been trying to, and I think, I don't know how much percentage, but they've got a fair percentage. But
Yeah.
some names that were in the book and stuff, and they showed up on the list. They can't be many left.
No, there are very few left now.
Some of them are really active.
Although my dad's younger brother, who was a Marine and was actually at Iwo Jima, he's 94, and he read the book before it was published, so I wanted to make sure there wasn't anything in it that he disagreed with or didn't think should come out. And he's still sharp as could be and walks around with his hat. He wears a cap that says, "I'm an Iwo Jima survivor." And he walks around with that today. So there's still a few around. But that's because he was 17 and my dad was 27. There were girls in between. Yeah.
The Veterans Administration may have separate independent records.
Yeah, I could. It's worth checking. Sure. Yeah.
Brothers joined different services, Marines, the Navy, and the Army, is that right?
So my dad had one brother. So my dad chose infantry. His brother chose. Yeah, my dad was Army infantry, and his brother was the Marines. And my uncle, my mom's sister, she was very close to, he was the Navy on a destroyer, and his brother was on a sub. This sort of, it's a little bit of a side note, but I'll just share it. It's an amazing story. So my uncle's brother, who I knew growing up, his name is Paul, and he had been on this sub for several years. And after a certain amount of service on the sub, you got rotated off for a little R&R. So he and a buddy got rotated off, and they were in California, and the sub sunk with all the buddies that they had been with for years. And he lived for years. It was just so troubling that had happened. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking around the
Yeah.
pieces here, and my father was in the Navy, and I have books, I have all these photo albums from the Navy. But I think my father was very young. I think he only actually went to China like the very last year before. But it's interesting, I have letters that he wrote, but they're all kind of, I don't know what they're about or who they're written about, but you're kind of inspiring me to kind of look at it again and figure out.
To take a look.
What
And I will mention to you, there was a talk last night in town at the Postal Museum. There's a gentleman by the name of Andrew Carroll who has devoted his adult life to collecting American war letters from all wars. And his center is at Chapman University in LA. And he lives in Washington, D.C., and he would be happy to receive any donations of letters or, yeah. So you just Google Andrew Carroll. Okay, yeah. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much. You've been a great audience.
Thank you very much.